Good afternoon. I think we're going to get started. Good afternoon and welcome to everybody to the Inter-American Dialogue, and thank you all for joining us for this event. This is the Dialogue's second event that we've done on with a focus on smart cities. It builds on a session that we had last fall that featured some new research by the McKinsey Global Institute, and we had speakers from AT&T, BMW, and the Inter-American Development Bank. We looking at the challenges that major cities in the region face in realizing the benefits of the digital economy, and to match what has been accomplished and the progress that's been made in some other parts of the world. Our daily publication, the Latin American Advisor, which I think many of you receive, has been looking at these issues in some depth, covering 5G and how technology could roll out in the region and accelerate the region's place in the digital economy. There's great potential, but also, big obstacles to progress remain to ensure that digital economy will be inclusive and will meet expectations. I want to acknowledge and thank very much the publisher of the Advisor and the head of the Dialogue's corporate program, Eric Brand, who's in the back, for giving such a priority attention to this critical topic, which will only become more important, and also for putting together this event. And also to thank Caitlin Blancett for all of her support and assistance with this event. The session will begin with remarks from our distinguished speaker, the mayor of San Salvador. The mayor's remarks will be followed then by a panel discussion that will be moderated by Margaret Myers, who's the director here of the Asia and Latin America program, and also has been following and tracking this issue very, very closely. A variety of questions I think we want to address in this session. What are the business models that are best suited to Latin America and the Caribbean? What will customers be able to and willing to pay? And will the region's countries work together to harmonize spectrum and regulatory systems? In El Salvador, big changes are underway. The new president, Nayib Bukele, opened the speech at the United Nations, if you remember, by taking a cell phone picture of himself at the podium. I'm not going to do that, so I'm sorry to disappoint you, but I'm not going to do that. But he noted that more people will see that selfie on social media than will hear his speech. Over the past 5 years, the country, El Salvador, has almost doubled its number of unique mobile internet subscribers, accounting for nearly half the population. Today, we are extremely fortunate and honored to have with us the mayor of San Salvador. He's been mayor since May 1st of 2018, ERNESTO MUYSHONDT. Is that right? Sort of, yeah. Ernesto, who has kindly agreed to share some of his thoughts about the role of technology in improving government and services to citizens. The mayor is a politician and also is a businessman who is a member of the Arena Party. So, Mr. Mayor, thank you so much for being with us. It's a great honor to have you, and the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. I first want to thank Michael Schiffer and the Inter-American Dialogue for the invitation to participate in this important event. A special thanks to all the audience for joining this timely discussion on the 5G in Latin America and our way through smart cities. I have been mayor of San Salvador for a little over a year and a half. And as you know, the biggest problem and challenges we have is making our city more secure so we can help build more and better opportunities for our people, especially the most vulnerable and the most needed. We no longer have the shameful distinction of being the most dangerous city in the world. But we still have a long ways to go to fix this problem. We are focusing on implementing adequate communication and information technologies through our Smart City project, which will drastically improve security and the municipality's ability to improve our efficiency of our services and be more effective in solving our people's problems. Being able to take advantage of 5G technologies is a key to our goals. That is why we need to develop a flexible and adaptable platform and system that will enable us to take advantage of 5G and transition towards the adaptation of new technologies, automation, and the Internet of Things. San Salvador is, as you may know, the capital city of El Salvador with a population of around 600,000, roughly the same as Washington, D.C. We have a geographical area of a little over 46 square miles. D.C. has approximately 68 square miles. Like Washington, D.C., the population that sleeps and makes a home in the city is around 600,000, but during the day, a lot of people come from other suburbs and use our facilities, use our municipal services, and they pay their taxes elsewhere. Several times more of the population that sleeps in the city. The greater metropolitan area of San Salvador has close to 3 million people, almost half of our population living in the country in a 235 square mile area. So another challenge we have once we establish a successful smart city platform in our municipality is to share our experience with the other 30 municipalities that make the greater San Salvador, and so more people can benefit from our efforts we're implemented. We are aware that the road to a smart city will require a string of public and private partnerships and a bottom-up approach. We have an extremely low budget, so bringing private investment, especially to take advantage of 5G, is a key, as well as getting our citizens involved and engaged in defining priorities that will help make their lives better. I made the example of the similarities between San Salvador and our sister city, Washington, D.C., in terms of population and geographical area. But there's something that we're not nearly as similar, and that's in our budget. We have in San Salvador roughly a $100 million a year budget. Washington, D.C. has $15 billion. For the same population, they have about 150 times more resources than we have. So that makes it more important to bring the national government, bring the private sector, together with the municipal government to work in building that ecosystem to make 5G technologies a success in our city. It is essential to work together, to join efforts as partners, since both spectrum and fiber are both critical requirements for 5G deployment are under the control of the national government. That's our case in El Salvador. We have a government that's from a different political party, but we have a very good working relationship with that central government right now. I get criticized in my party for working together with Nayib Bukele and his government, but that's the old way of doing politics, where we have a confrontative, polarizing division between all the political parties and governments working against municipal governments. I think we have to leave that behind, and we have to put our people in front, our country's and our city's interests up front, and try to build on the things we have in common and leave the things that separate us on the side. So that's, I think, the way we can be successful in making good use of information and communication technologies for the benefit of our government services and for the benefit of our people, especially the most vulnerable and needed people in our country. Current cellular infrastructure in our country, as in most Latin American and Caribbean countries, do not allow the adequate response for safe and smart city ventures, whether for broad width and availability reasons or for latency reasons. 5G should be a right solution for a variety of smart city applications. At present, the answer to our limitation is through microwave channels or fiber optics, which represent enormously expensive and sophisticated solutions. In large and vibrant cities, optical fiber and microwave channels can be utilized in finance for public proximity programs. Still, for smaller cities in underdeveloped nations, 5G should be a very viable level for implementing our smart city venture with significantly reduced investment. That is, if we are able to get together the central government, the municipal government, the private sector to work, sharing our same vision. 5G requires the participation of more players compared to previous generations of technologies. So our role as a local government will center in bringing together the central government or the national government and the private sector to work together with us to generate the framework for more automated services, both private and public services. 5G can support that. The Internet of Things provides an immense variety of applications in the near future in smart city initiatives like security, garbage collection, and better responding to national disasters. In our case, we're a very vulnerable city with a lot of propensity for national disasters and a lot of people living in very vulnerable and dangerous conditions. Out of the 1,243 population centers we have in the municipality of San Salvador, roughly a third of them are in vulnerable positions and exposed to dangerous areas of natural disasters. That will most likely be a transition from 4G and 5G in the year 2020 for most Latin American and Caribbean countries. Many of the providers are already pushing the new technologies, and governments have started the process of auction of 5G spectrum. So it is the most for a policy and legal framework to evolve so it can effectively respond to technological advancements. So that's very important. We have to make our legal and regulatory framework evolve as fast as the new technologies are evolving, something our countries have not been very good at in the past. So that's a challenge we have to impose as a municipality. Hopefully, if we push forward as a municipality and as the municipality that's the reference for the other 261 municipalities in the country, we can get the government together to move faster as well and help build all that ecosystem that the private sector needs for them to invest in 5G technology. We should also prioritize the development and growth of our Internet of Things ecosystem by using existing infrastructure while 5G is implemented. We need to use 2G, 3G, and other existing infrastructure to build that ecosystem and all the applications that would make a transition to 5G easier and smoother. More comprehensive tools and joint efforts by operators and both municipal and national governments are needed to determine the readiness of our cities for 5G. Also, those efforts need to be the most transparent as possible, as well as to guarantee the smooth transition towards it. We're in the process of implementing our smart city that has its central focus on security. That's by far our biggest problem, and security has implications in generating investment, more and better jobs for our people and opportunities. So if we solve or if we continue to reduce the violence and delinquency indexes in our city, in our country, San Salvador has roughly 9% of the population of El Salvador, a municipality, and only about a third of a percentage of the area of the country. And the greater San Salvador has close to 3 million people, or almost half the population of the country. So what happens in San Salvador, it's something that has an impact on the rest of the country, the rest of the city. So if we do things right, we can be a reference for the other municipalities in the other areas of the country. We're gonna install close to 1,500 cameras in different areas in our streets and neighborhoods, public areas and exits and entries of the city. Cameras with very sophisticated plate reading capacities or facial recognition in key areas of the city. That would be a very important dissuasive for delinquent activities in our city, and also will bring tools for the police for both the municipal and national police to work together to combat crime more effectively, as well as give the tools to the Attorney General's office to judicialize and persecute crime in case someone commits criminal activities in our city. We're already doing a much better job in reducing criminal activity in our country. San Salvador has reduced at a bigger proportion the violence activities than the rest of the city. A lot has to do with us working together in an efficient way with the central government, but also on our prevention policies, especially recuperating public spaces, using sports, arts, cultural activities, educational activities to bring our youth away from violence, and also giving second opportunities to those people that have been in delinquent activities, mostly gangs, to come out of those habits and become decent citizens in our society. Free wireless and Wi-Fi connectivity is something that we're also aiming at as a way to promote education, to promote some, especially for the youth, to have another thing to do besides going into gangs and that kind of stuff. And it's been very successful for us. We also have a program called Canchas para Todos, or Courts for All, that has been very successful in recuperating public spaces for sports activities. And it's made a great dramatic change. And for example, a community, even if it's in a socioeconomic condition much poorer than other, reduces delinquential indexes up to 4 times when it has a court in good condition. Even if it's a very small court for people to play soccer 3 against 3, but if it's illuminated, it's in good condition, it reduces criminal activity in that population center up to 4 times compared to a place that doesn't have a court, or has one that's abandoned or in bad condition. We're going to have panic buttons in the main public areas that people can connect themselves directly to our operation and monitoring center. Our municipal police will have geolocalization and body cams for us to allocate our resources to the areas of incidents, and to be able to approach a problem in a more efficient and timely way. Our 24/7 data center, real-time monitoring, recording, and archive. As we get the 5G technology going with the Internet of Things, we can become much more efficient in other services besides making our city more secure. I talked about the garbage collecting or other municipal services that can be much more efficiently implemented with the 5G technologies. We also need a bottom-up approach, and that means involving our citizenship a lot, establishing their priorities and becoming involved in this process. We already have an app called Smart 912 that allows people to denounce any problem that needs municipal attention, either regarding a public space in bad condition, a street that needs repairing, a light bulb that is not functioning, or garbage areas, or something that needs a municipal attention. It's geolocalized. It allows us to go to the unit of the municipal government that's responsible for that area, and makes us able to keep track on how long it takes for us to solve the problem, or to give attention to what it's worked a lot for us. But that, combined with the smart city platform, I think it's going to have a much better income. Response units will be equipped with body cams and smart application. Command and control center equipped with the most cutting edge technology. That's something that's going to be a reality in the first couple of months of next year. We're in a process of a licitation where 23 companies from all over the world are participating. We expect to adjudicate it around the 20th of December, and to start with that project, as I said, in the first couple of months of next year. El Salvador, or San Salvador, we wanted to be at the vanguard in Central America and the Caribbean in smart cities, and hopefully also if we can bring the private sector and the central government together in the 5G technologies. Smart analytic and synopsis technologies will also be applied to identify suspicious behavior of people, vehicles, dangerous objects, intrusion detection, etc. Face detection and recognition. That's something that hasn't been implemented in Central America. So we're trying to build this cutting edge technology and platform to make San Salvador a referent for the region, and hopefully help other neighboring municipalities to adopt the things we're doing for us to make our country safer, and especially the larger metropolitan area of San Salvador, which is where more delinquency activities happen in our country. So that's basically an introduction of what we're doing and how we're trying to approach this, and how we need to work together with the legal framework, the building together of ecosystem to make this 5G technologies available to improve the lives of most of our people, especially the most vulnerable. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor, for those excellent remarks, getting us off to a terrific start. And now I invite my colleague Margaret Myers and the speakers for the panel to come up, and we'll get started. Thank you.
Well, welcome everyone. And those were terrific comments. I think that set us up very nicely for this panel discussion. It is a tremendous pleasure to introduce such a really terrific and expert group of panelists to help us understand recent mobile and other technological advances and what needs to happen for us to achieve eventual deployment of these technologies in the Latin American context in particular. The prospect of 5G and its many often yet unknown applications is an extremely attractive one for the region. Not just El Salvador, but many other countries in the region have expressed considerable interest and also indicated some progress in even deploying, test cases in certain cities. Uruguay has, for example, made some efforts, and those have been well documented in the media. But it's worth asking what impediments, aside even from those that were mentioned by the mayor, still exist to ensuring access to new generation mobile technologies. Also, what can 5G speeds and low latency actually do for Latin America? The 5G or the smart cities applications that were mentioned by the mayor are some of the best known applications so far, but what other applications might we consider in the Latin American context? And can they help to address some of the region's most pressing development challenges? And of course, as we sit here in Washington, D.C., we hope to understand with a bit more clarity the U.S.-China tech war and its implications for Huawei in particular, which is a vendor and partner to many of the region's major service providers, and what all of this means for deployment of 5G and further development of Latin American smart cities in the coming years. Your speakers today, I know will be able to address many of these questions in addition to many others. They have extensive and numerous accolades and accomplishments, so allow me to just highlight, in the interest of time, a few of those. Eric CRABTREE is Chief Investment Officer at the International Finance Corporation. He is the global sector lead for data centers at the IFC and has financed a variety of projects in mobile, telecommunications towers, broadband, IT services, and data centers across emerging markets over the past 16 years. He has also received an MBA from Georgetown and interestingly majored in economics and Russian at Oberlin College. Luis Fiallo is responsible for business development at China Telecom Americas. He served as an advisor to President George W. Bush and a member of the President's Information Technology Committee, as well as on the Commonwealth of Virginia Governor Tim Kaine's Broadband Roundtable. He additionally served in senior business development positions with BCE Teleglobe and Applied Theory Corporation, as well as senior management roles at IBM, Sprint, and Cable and Wireless Communications. Ed Roach is, we have a bit of a, I'm not introducing in the right order here, I apologize. But Ed Roach is Vice President of Regulatory Compliance and Associate General Counsel at SBA Communications Corporation. He is responsible for ensuring SBA's compliance with regulations from the Federal Aviation Administration, the Federal Communications Commission, as well as those related to the National Environmental Policy Act and the state and tribal historic preservation legislation. He has been instrumental in sharing and advocating for a regulatory framework that encourages efficient deployment of wireless infrastructure in Canada and Latin America, so throughout the entire hemisphere. And Rachel Samrin is focused on developing and driving Millicom's global engagement with particular responsibility for special situation strategies. Rachel's background is in the risk management consulting sector, most recently as head of business intelligence at the Risk Advisory Group. Previously, she worked for Citigroup as well as non-governmental and governmental organizations. Rachel currently serves as chairman of the board of directors of Zantel. So with that, allow me to turn the floor over to our distinguished panelists, who I'll ask to please stick to the determined time frame for your presentation so that we can maximize opportunity for questions and answers. A reminder to have your mics on, and if you can hold them as closely as possible to your mouth, that's very helpful. Not for our audience here in the room, but so that those listening to the webcast from afar can hear you very clearly. And let's turn to Eric Crabtree first.
Thanks for the nice introduction. I probably should say something first about IFC and then get to some of the points you raised. IFC is part of the World Bank Group. We invest in emerging markets in the private sector. And the group that I'm a part of invests in the telecom, media, IT sector. But mainly what we're focused on is what I'll call digital infrastructure. And that includes the mobile networks. It includes the tower firms, it includes the data centers, and it includes all the flavors of fiber, submarine, terrestrial, metro networks, last mile, all of the above. And these are this is the connectivity part of what's needed for a smart city. So we are focused on the building blocks and the business models that work. I would say just in terms of scale, we have about 100 billion in assets globally. We're investing about 500 million a year in this particular these subsectors, and we've done a number of projects across Latin America. Now, you had asked about impediments. Is that something you want me to hit now, or? All right. Well, first is really the cost. If you look at what Verizon is spending, in the first half of the year, they spent $9 billion, according to my colleague. And so this is quite a bit of capital. And this is partly related to the 5G, but they've been spending at this rate or close to it to deploy 3 and then 4. And so you look at a company like Verizon, which enjoys a strong position in this near duopoly market, although that's been remedied to some extent. And they have a balance sheet that has a fair amount of debt on it. So their ability to deploy capital is going to be constrained, not just because the implementation of these networks is going to be held up by spectrum auctioning and getting the necessary infrastructure built, but also because they simply don't have the financial capacity. If you look at LATAM, $60 billion is estimated needed over the next 5 years for deployment. That's quite a bit of capital. Globally, it's $1 trillion. So this will only happen in stages, simply because of the financial constraints that the firms face. I would say that's kind of a number one. I'll let my colleagues talk about some of the other.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Louis Fiallo. I'm with China Telecom Americas. I've been pretty much since the inception of our company in the U.S. The company started around 2002, and I joined in 2004. And previously, I was, as Margaret mentioned, I was working for a lot of other telecom companies, so North American telecom companies. Our company, you may have some interest in learning, is that we've been operating as an international broadband company in the U.S. Since our inception. We've been helping multinationals get access to China and Asia, and as the China's market has evolved and grown, we've been helping Chinese companies come to the U.S. and to the Americas. And we have global operations today. I think it's over 45 countries that we reach around. And from the Americas region, we've actually extended ourselves to Canada, Brazil, recently in Panama. But when I was asked to speak on this topic, I thought it was a great opportunity, because if you think about China, obviously it has access to capital and it has a lot of resources. But when they think about smart cities, they think about a necessity of a way that people are going to live and continue to live, right? So I think that's a pretty good model. Our company, alone, have operate today in projects that in 29 provinces across China and over 200 cities. Okay, we're going after trying to help to create a better life. Some of it's in the areas of traffic management, security, parking, controlling bikes. But the main thing is to control the use of resources, electricity, water, right? These are the things that a country like China has to take very seriously. And if you think about some of where the world is going, by the year 2050, the number of people living in urban economies is going to go from about 2.6 to about 6 billion people, okay? The rest of the world needs to start doing this, right? And I think it's a necessity. Now, where I see 5G fitting into this is that it's complementary. And actually, it can take off on its own path, but it allows the intersection of technologies to come place, right? I think smart city technologies, although it's still evolving and somewhat limited in their deployment, needs 5G at some point. What 5G is going to do is going to help enable mission-critical applications. So these unmanned cars that need to be driving around. Okay, you can't wait on latency, right? At the same time, if you're going to be dealing with medical issues, okay, you got to be certain you can't have things going off and on in the middle of your surgery or whatever treatment you're taking place. So a lot of this stuff is still at the early stages. And I can tell you that our company has begun to participate in some of these projects in places like Ecuador, Argentina, Colombia. And the biggest struggle I see is that the governments want this. I think the mayor did a great job of introducing what needs to be done, okay? But one of the things that I've seen is that, first of all, the laws are not there to support this. And in particular case in Ecuador, they wanted to build a smart city, a place called Yachay, which is part of a university. And in that situation, they needed to have put in laws because they wanted to have it more secure than the rest of this Urkuki, which is a very little city. And because they want to be able to provide a tax-free zone, investment zone, and everything else like that. So it takes a lot of time and thinking from the regulators, the government, and everybody else, the municipalities. And I think that's where you see some of the shortcomings, right? Remember going back to the example of China. China's model has been to go out and do this for necessity to fill something that they needed to be able to better manage and provide a better life for everybody across China, okay? I'm saying the same concept that I have quite a few of these conversations with different government people that have reached out to us and asked us to cooperate with them. So these are little things that are really big things in order to be both of these things, both 5G and smart cities, to be really flourish in Latin America. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Ed Roach. I'm with SBA. I've been with SBA for 24 years, so I hope I'm able to impart some of the learning experiences I've had in the U.S. to others, and that people won't make the same mistakes that we made. 5G is very exciting. Everybody wants it. It's a new technology, but in my mind, it's really an evolution of existing technology. What we see is when people announce new spectrum, there's an excitement and enthusiasm, but ultimately there's an equation that I know from my years of experience, which is spectrum plus fiber plus infrastructure equals cutting edge wireless technology. And I'm on the infrastructure side of the house. SBA owns over 30,000 towers in 14 different countries, 11 in Latin America. And I also appreciated the mayor's comments earlier where he talked about working together with the industry and trying to get a regulatory framework that works not only for the companies, but also for the jurisdictions and the countries and the cities. We've been very aggressive as an industry in the United States. We work closely with the FCC, which is our regulator, but also we look at it as we want to work closely with them so that we can achieve the ultimate goal, which is in the U.S. was broadband connectivity for all residents. Real quickly, I talk about the spectrum issue, and I just tell this real quick story for those who don't know. When they first initially rolled out spectrum in the United States, it required a $2,000 application fee. And for that application, the inherent landline provider, Verizon, Pac Bell, South Bell, they actually automatically received one of the licenses. The other licensee got it through just a lottery. The government actually wised up and realized, hey, why don't we have an auction instead? So the first set of auctions, I just remember this particular market because I was working there at the time. So Verizon at the time paid $2,000 for their spectrum. Sprint came in and paid $550 million for their spectrum. So I think it's a pretty solid competitive advantage. So what happened there, what was critically important was the government said, we're going to auction this, and people paid a lot of money for it. But what the federal government did is they followed up with the Telecommunications Act of 1996. And that act basically precluded jurisdictions from prohibiting wireless deployment in their jurisdictions. So if you lived in Beverly Hills, for example, you couldn't say, we don't want any towers here. Now, they could choose where they want the tower, and they could limit it and do a lot of other different things. But the point was these people were paying a lot for the licenses, and they needed the ability to deploy it. I actually met with the Canadian Embassy about 5 years ago, or maybe 7 years ago, and they asked, how is it working in the United States? Because they had licensed off a tremendous amount of spectrum, made a lot of money, but the new entrants were unable to get the infrastructure to provide that service. So that's a crucial point in all of this, and we've learned that there's an efficient way to deploy this infrastructure to provide the cutting edge service, in this case 5G. I'm sure it won't be long before people are talking about 6G, but for now, that's why I always refer to it as cutting edge wireless services. So what we've learned is that we want to encourage co-location, meaning we put one tower, one piece of infrastructure somewhere, and then it's able to be used by multiple licensees. It's efficient, it's environmentally friendly, and in addition to that, it creates a competitive environment. Competitive environments mean lower costs for the users. More users means more access, more opportunity. People talk about what their phone can do. When the phones get rolled out in certain places, I look at a phone as it's like a key. It's a key to a whole new world of possibilities for people. And we want to get as many people using this with the best technology possible.
Thank you. It's great to go last because so many good points have been made. So you can kind of just try and sort of pull them all together. But maybe for those of you who are not familiar with Millicom, we are perhaps better known by a brand name Tigo. And we operate in all of Central America as well as Colombia, Paraguay, and Bolivia. We're a very large mobile and cable provider in all of those markets. I would like to maybe take a step back. I completely agree that 5G is extremely exciting. It will be very exciting. But I think perhaps that, looking at one of the questions that Margaret posed to us, is it hype or is it reality? You could say it's neither and it's both. I think it's probably the reality to really talk about. Because right now it's a lot of hype. It will become reality at some point because there is always a technical evolution. But exactly what that means, as you rightly put it yourself, right? There are many unknown applications of this, is still to be determined. And so I think it's really important that while we're still a little bit in the hype phase, that we also put this into context of what is it actually valuable for and who is it really going to benefit, as was already remarked upon here by some of my fellow panelists. So looking at Latin America and not just our markets, but Latin America in general, there's no question that mobile technology so far has done wonders for digital inclusion, closing the so-called digital gap. However, there is still a long way to go. We think about the internet here in the US in a very different way than what it is available in the markets where we operate. It simply doesn't exist the same way. 4G is normal for all of us. Now, the reality is that in Latin America, at this point in time, 4G market share is only at 44%. The US or North America is 87%. The world average is 51%. So my first point is there is still a lot of work to be done, and important work to be done with the 4G rollouts. And why is that so important? Why can't we just say we just want 5G straight away? Well, as was said already by my colleagues, first of all, it's prohibitively expensive at this point in time. Secondly, there are not yet any proven use cases. We don't yet know exactly how this will work and where it will work best and where it can be used efficiently. But more importantly, we need to close that digital divide before we actually move on to any technology that's great for cities. We have a huge part of the population who do not yet have internet access. There is a difference between rural and urban areas. There's a difference between the amount of women and men that own mobile phones. But more importantly, that's also an inhibitor to socioeconomic development, because we know it's a fact that when we get more people online, more people connected, they will ultimately become part of the digital economy. They can help drive socioeconomic development. So point number one is we need to focus on where we are right now, while, of course, at the same time, look to the future. And there's a lot of things that need to be put in place to really be able to achieve that 5G future. But for now, our focus certainly is keep on building the digital highways that can really help connect people and thereby, build communities, improve lives, and drive socioeconomic development, something that we need to do together with governments in the markets that we are. At the same time, of course, yes, we should focus on 5G, but there needs to be a plan for 5G. I absolutely agree with the mayor. It can do wonderful things for cities like San Salvador, but we need to think of it much more holistically. First of all, spectrum. Spectrum is required. Latin America is woefully behind in terms of allocating spectrum according to the ITU's recommendations. Not just 5G. We're talking way before that. So that is something that needs to be addressed. It needs to be made available. It needs to be affordable, as we heard here. I think a recent GSMA report, the Global Mobile Association, showed that in Latin America or in developing markets, the cost of spectrum is about 3 times as high as in developing markets. So think about the numbers you heard here and then think about what that means in Latin America versus the income that can actually sustain it, or the capital flows or the loans that we can have to actually be able to purchase this. So we need to have spectrum availability, reasonable pricing, look at the investment cases, which for 5G still are unknown in many ways. And then finally, we need that holistic approach where it's about the regulatory modernization that was mentioned. We need to look at a lot more than just the spectrum, the security of investment. And I think for those of you who have the flyer in front of you, or the little magazine, as the LATAM GSMA representative said, the taxation of the sector, the energy prices, judicial certainty of investment. 5G is not just a nice to have little thing that we all want to buy. 5G can transform, absolutely, countries, societies, and safety, but it needs to be put into a much more holistic perspective. What does it mean for education, for staffing, for labor, for security. It needs to be a holistic plan. So we need regulators to change from being supervisors to being proactive modernizers and work hand in hand, cross-governmental, to actually make this work. So just putting that out there, absolutely enthusiastic and very, very excited about it. But there is a very, very big reality challenge first also that we need to deal with in order to make this successful.
Terrific. Terrific. Well, thank you all for the really excellent and comprehensive and complimentary commentary. That was extremely informative. Let me ask you to maybe do an exercise that I don't even know if this is possible for you to answer or not. But for those of us who sort of lay people in the room who are wondering about the time frame for all of this, I mean, there is a degree of hype, of course, but things are progressing, and at this very moment, standards are being determined for the deployment of 5G globally. So, what can we expect in terms of time frame? Which countries in the region are more advanced in this respect, whether in terms of their understanding and regulatory capacity, but also perhaps they have more attractive investment environments for operators, for providers, for vendors, and what also this also will be affected, of course, by the tech war, by U.S.-China competition in the region, and by U.S. laws and the extent to which they affect not only U.S. companies, but companies that operate in the U.S. to some degree, potentially. So should we expect a much longer time frame as a result of all of this? And where does the region stand, really?
Test of those. On the security issue, I don't know how important that's going to be in LATAM. It's important to the citizens, but in terms of the China-U.S. tension, I'm not convinced it ends up being that an important part of the narrative in LATAM. Huawei is going to compete for networks, it's going to provide services. I think the governments so far have decided that's fine. So I'm not quite sure if that's really going to be end up as an important driver. I do think, however, that one of the features of 5G is it's very spectrum hungry. And the way it's designed, it's sort of 3 different tiers of spectrum. You have to allocate quite a bit of spectrum in order to enable all of the features of 5G. And that process is complicated because each country's got a different legacy of who occupies what bands, what's been auctioned, and a different process. And of course, the governments are sometimes cash hungry, so they have to weigh against maximizing price versus actually getting services rolled out. And then the operators themselves may not want to bid now because they're building out 4G. They haven't even gotten the returns. So if you were to ask me, I'd say, well, 2021, we'll see some auctions. There's some clear suspects, in Mexico and Brazil and Chile and Uruguay and some others. They'll all do it a bit differently because they have to. Their legacy systems are quite different. So it will happen, and it will have quite a bit of an impact. But one of the challenges at the national level truly is related to spectrum. I would say, however, if you get down to a municipal level, and one thing, if you take a mayor of San Salvador who was talking to us about this, the number one concern there was security. Now, in a like manner, Crown Castle is rolling out in the United States, and it is doing a lot of small cells. And that's the data sort of centric model that they are following, less of the macro model. Well, in order to get permits in U.S. cities, it's difficult. And Crown's trying to deploy 10,000 small cells this quarter. It's clogged up all the municipal pipes. So Crown says, well, what's the mayor's number one agenda item in that city? A lot of times it might be 911 service, which is a subset of security. And they figure out a way to help address this as a part of doing their rollout. And in that way, the municipal levers that are important, and this is where a city has influence, rights of way, the permitting process, are there shared assets that are owned by the city that, equipment can be placed upon, and any fees and taxation that they levy. There are a lot of how not to examples in this country and outside. for example, in Istanbul, we found it very hard to get business in our data center. It's 10 times fiber cost in Istanbul than London. It's because of rights-of-way challenges. It's a huge city, bureaucratic, it has historic zones. In Argentina, they're levying very high fees on towers, prohibitively high. So that actually prevents a tower being built in the town. Town has control over this. In like manner, if you have many permitting offices, as you often do in the United States, there's a time-consuming and inconsistency applied in permitting. In Nicaragua, they have a one-stop shop. So there are examples of how not to and how to. And municipalities do have ability to help affect this, in addition to being vocal on a national level about, how industry is experiencing national policy and what their voice is. Anyway, anyway, I don't see this before 2021 in LATAM.
You want me to add, don't you?
Sure.
I agree that it's going to take some time because, first of all, I think Latin America is underserved as far as cell towers and coverage. All right, let's take Buenos Aires, for example. You fly in to their international airport, you drive in to the city itself, you're going to go through dark spots, okay? Your cell phone's not going to work, right? They need more towers, all right? I think the challenge is that they want, this is a source of revenues for the governments, right? You can go out and auction more space and all these things. I think that's a challenge for them to think about what is, do I enable this in an easier way? You gave an example of a city, smaller cities, where they're probably going to sit there and make that big part of their money for that year, okay, by auctioning out some space and stuff. And 5G is small tower cells, okay? It's not like big towers where you see them out here and they're up on top of buildings, okay? They're proliferating the whole town, right? And first of all, it's going to cost money. Somebody's going to have to pay for this. I don't think the governments, with the exception of a few governments, have thought through how they're going to fund this, okay? Until they figure out, where they're going to, where their sources of money is going to come in. They talk a lot about private partnerships, but you got to make an incentive for companies like mine to go out and want to do it, okay? I want to help, and I do it for monetary reasons as well as helping the society, but it still has to be there, and there's got to be a return. And that's the struggle with 5G. I think it will get implemented. I think it will get implemented over time. I think if you look at the countries that have already deployed it, countries like starting to deploy, like the U.S., China, South Korea, Japan, we're going to learn, okay? And other Latin America is going to pick up some of these things, and they're going to sit there and say these are important for us, important enough for us that we're willing to make some changes and sacrifices to what we're currently doing that may be prohibiting other investments in the future for 5G. Thank you.
So I think the leaders are yet to be determined, and I think that'll be determined on which governments are most responsive to these issues. And frankly, SBA, we are not a carrier. We are not licensed to provide, or we don't own any spectrum. We don't transmit or receive, but we are very excited about all these Latin American markets. And what we look for is a regulatory framework that is transparent, enforceable, and encourages co-location. So it's easy to write up an ordinance or write up a regulation, but if the government will not enforce it at the end of the day, then your investment is at risk. And that's really what we look at. We've been really excited and enthusiastic about the markets we're in now, and we hope to invest further.
I don't think it would be very healthy for me to rank our countries being someone who goes and sees the governments in them, sort of to say who's better or worse. But I think that the key thing is really the interest, as we heard from Mayor MUYSHONTT, as we know from President Bukele, and quite frankly from most of the markets where we operate. They want this because they do realize that there's something that's going to be very, very beneficial from the perspective of security, automation, traffic control, day-to-day issues that can be solved. I think that's a really, really good starting point. But then I do think, indeed, as been said, that needs to then also factor in, a sort of thought through process of avoiding trying to get cash for this year's budget. Instead, think about what is this going to actually benefit you in the medium to long term, making sure that you have modern practices and regulation in place, making sure that that capital can be attracted for us to be able to actually buy it. And that's not our decision necessarily. We're many of us that are listed companies. We need this capital to come from elsewhere, whether that's London, Stockholm in our case, New York. These investors want to make sure that they feel comfortable with the countries that we're talking about, right? We're talking about emerging markets that comes with a lot of other risks. They do want to support us, and it's a great way for them to invest in the development of those countries, but there needs to be a comfort level as well. This is not something that just sort of magically appears. So it does need a very thought through and holistic process. I also think it's worth remembering that we're looking at two different uses here. We're talking about us, the consumers, and what do we get out of 5G and what do we want? And we're talking about what's going to be the more likely first scenario, the B2B, sort of the machine driven part of it. That will probably come sooner. But I think realistically also, we don't need it as soon for individuals, because what we all want, certainly what I want, is reliable service, good quality of service, and fast service. The increases for me individually with 5G is not necessarily first on my list of priorities as long as I have a really, really good functioning 4G network. However, you do need 5G in order to be able to have more connected devices in the same geographic area. I think the statistic is something that with 4G you can support about 4,000 devices within 1 square kilometer. 5G takes us to 1 million. Now, those implications are fantastic for things that have to do with automation, with industrials, right, with logistics. Doesn't really matter as much necessarily for individuals really right now or next year. So I think, actually I've won a bet, Margaret, thank you, because this morning I called one of our most senior technology officers in the company. I said, I bet you someone is going to ask, when do we get it? And he's like, no. And I was like, yes. So his view was that realistically, for this to be affordable to consumers and really something that we want, need, and is affordable, we're probably looking 4 or 5 years out, right? But that doesn't mean that we won't have 5G before. We will, but it will be more the B2B focused version.
That, the well thought out planning, the strategic vision must also take into account some of the potential drawbacks associated with these new technologies, especially in the labor space. If, broader, faster, better mechanization is in fact part of this in those countries that have very strong manufacturing sectors. Let me, in the interest of time, turn to the audience for questions and answers. Anyone have a question that they'd like to ask of our panelists? Yes, and please identify yourself. Here's a microphone.
Hi, I'm Mike Samararo. I'm an entrepreneur in Latin American region. Luis, this question is for you. You mentioned there's some inherent risk with ROI for private sector operators within the PPP model. Could you help me understand what some of those risks are again? And could you also maybe provide an example of what would be a sustainable PPP model in the region that governments and private sector operators could all buy into?
If I follow your question correctly, and good afternoon. My position about the challenges with the PPP model is that the projects they've been more successful are very large projects. Okay, what we're talking about in the 5G or smart city, these are smaller projects. I'm sure that my fellow panelists will tell you, some of I think they have a separate group just focused on smart cities because it's a different investment type. So the problem, and then you got the other issue about, how big is the population and how you're going to get your money back. I think those are the fundamental challenges you have with the PPP for small cell towers that are going to be deployed to support 5G. Okay. And these are small cell towers. I mean, if you get investors that are willing to sit around for a while and let it go, I think you're good. But if you're trying to do this and make a return and cash out in 3 to 5 years, I think it's going to be tough. And I think the governments also they have certain objectives they try to meet too, right? Because the government's job is to collect revenues or tax revenues and regulatory fees in order to be able to fund everything they're doing. I think somebody mentioned earlier that, you know, the key is to try to take some projects that is a necessity. The mayor is talking about security, right? I think that's a necessity in his situation. Okay, so he's going to do everything humanly possible to focus on that. Find those kind of projects. I think you're going to find a better ROI.
Yes, I do have one question for Ed there. Ed, you mentioned at the beginning that you were in the evolution of deployment of infrastructure in the U.S. What do you think will be the 3 key learnings from the U.S. that Latin America should take into account, not only for 5G implementation, but in general to improve connectivity and expand coverage?
So the most critical thing, frankly, from our perspective, is just have the appropriate regulatory framework. Like I said earlier, we're willing to invest. The 3 things that we need to, what we see is transparency and, you know, enforceability and a means to enforce and encourage co-location on towers. Because what was just mentioned before about investments, it's a different market there. And the right of way is actually really being used in certain markets. And for those who thinks it might just be an issue in Latin America, I work with WIA in the United States, which is the Wireless Infrastructure Association. We've helped pass legislation in 27 states now that addresses use of the right of way. The carriers propose that they get to use the right of way in cities and counties for $20 a year. Some jurisdictions don't think that's enough. California, there was a bill approved by the legislature, and former Governor Jerry Brown vetoed that bill because the jurisdictions felt like they weren't getting enough in return for the use of their not owned but regulated area. So, I mean, those are the things we really need to see. Is we need to see the framework and know that when we make an investment, it has the, you know, we really have a legitimate opportunity of getting a return on our investment and not risking what we're putting in there.
Okay. A question for whoever in the panel wants to take it, but what do you see as exciting use case for the B2B 5G that you were mentioning?
Well, I don't know how exciting it is, but I think it might be one of the big ones, which is manufacturing. I mean, if you look at what my colleague was talking about, B2B applications, I think a lot of what's going to happen is the carriers are well positioned to do sort of custom networks that are engineered for a particular set of tasks. They're very good at understanding radio frequency planning and the various layers of technology needed. So if you have a factory and you want to automate as many processes within a factory, the manufacturing, the movement of goods inside it, and then tracking goods and all the rest of it, that's a great use case. It's very data heavy. It needs layers of different kind of network sophistication and very specific planning. The carriers are actually really well positioned, in my opinion, to do this kind of work because they don't, you know, the RF knowledge has not really permeated the tower companies, and it's not really a part of their soul. So I think that's one of them that the industry will latch onto right away.
Can I add? So what we're talking about is slicing, which is a way of taking 5G technology and carving out for a specific application. If you think about what you can do then, first of all, today we have machine-to-machine intelligence already in place. Okay, a lot of these things today, you know, you guys, some of you took Uber, okay, right? There's not a person on the other side of this app trying to solve your problems, okay? It's the machines are talking to each other, okay? These applications exist today, right? There's little companies in Tyson's Corner, Reston, Virginia, right, that are building these little, and I call them the non-sexy but smart guys, companies and people that are actually trying to solve for carriers like us to be able to use that technology, okay? Because we're not going to build it, okay? And they're building it, and it's a point solution, and it gets done. It provides a lot of value. The second thing is that it's also moving towards a world where we're going to see artificial intelligence have a more meaningful existence, okay? Some of these things are probably going to be ahead of the governments, all right, and the deployment of these things. New York City, you guys, everybody I assume has visited New York City. Walk around Manhattan, okay? All of a sudden you're starting to see more of these about 12 feet, 8 feet billboards, okay? Guess what? There's 5G technology embedded in there, okay? You didn't even know this was going on, right? So these things are happening for B2B applications, right? And that's where a lot of people are starting to build out. And I think there's opportunity for you guys who are looking to create a new business for yourselves. So I think it's very promising.
The one that always seems to come up every panel I've ever been on or conference I've attended is autonomous vehicles. So everybody just seems real excited about this. The last conference I was at with the members of the industry, they took a poll. How many people think we'll have autonomous vehicles within the next 2 years? 20% raised their hand. How many people think in 5 to 10 years? 30% raised their hand. How many think never? Another group raised their hand. So, but it just seems like to be the really exciting element that people are looking forward to. So we'll see what happens.
The flip side of that is from the city control system, right? That they, you know, they can actually use the same system probably to actually traffic management and planning. So.
And the really terrifying one is, of course, these surgeries from afar. To me, this is the most terrifying example at the very least. So we had another question right here.
Hi, hello. I'm Paola Diorti. I'm a journalist from Brazil. And as Brazil is the largest country in Latin America, I would like to ask you if you could give more of a broad idea which issues are the most important as regards the implementation of 5G in Brazil right now, and if each one of you could talk a little bit about Brazil in this matter, it would be good.
Yeah, obviously it's a very important market, and we have been involved there for a while. The government is just starting, I think, the process of how to assign the spectrum for 5G, and because it is, the bands on 5G are a lot wider. 5G requires a lot more spectrum to be implemented properly. And it's in 3 tiers. You know, there's the long distance part, there's the mid range, and then there's the stuff that's in your face, you know, and is the really big pipe for broadband. So I think in every country that's a challenge. I would imagine that's probably an impediment in Brazil. They have to get through a process. There's a regulatory body. I think Anatel is very competent and very forward-looking, but things have to get through Parliament. There have to be, and there's money at stake. For a government that's trying to manage finances, like most governments, carefully, then they have to weigh the cost of this. Now, no doubt industry's already talking to them closely. And it may be the industry could be messaging to them, well, look, we need, to build up on 4G yet. We've invested a lot in this. We paid a lot for the 4G spectrum. The country's penetration rate for 4G may be 50% or some number like this. People are still struggling to afford those handsets. So the industry may be signaling all to the government. It's like, look, we're not going to give you $4 billion for that spectrum. And so the government also is going to time the auction towards a maximum return. And in that, it's going to have a dialogue with industry about, okay, when are they ready, right? Because one of the big factors in Brazil right now is what happens with Oi. All right, so is it going to be an in-market consolidation in Brazil? Question one. And if not, is there a new entrant? And that's a big question in terms of the spectrum auctions and the degree of competition. But just one final thing on the handsets, just as an example. Okay, I don't have a 5G handset, right? So I thought, well, I'll go see is $1,200. So I thought, well, I can't afford that. So I'm not going to get one of these things for a while, right? And then I looked in China, and they think next year they might get the price down to $300. That's probably something I can afford, but how wide a point is that in Brazil? I don't know, right? So the handset cost, the handset barrier remains a potential block for a good chunk of the population. So you ask yourself, is this going to be sort of downtown Sao Paulo, Rio, you know, and that's it? You know, those are some of the questions I have.
But just wanted to add on that specific point, right? Maybe we don't think about it so much, but that is when we're looking at the consumer usage, right, of 5G. Maybe a good comparison is, think about a Tesla. We all know that's great, you know, efficient, the sort of the next generation. But do we all really feel we need it now? Are we all willing to spend what it costs right now? No, right? And that's the same with the 5G handset, because if you can get something that works really well and works really well for what you want and need, then you're probably going to wait till the price comes down. And I think that's exactly what we're going to face also with the 5G handsets.
That was my point earlier. There just sort of gets this spectrum auction fever that governments get because they look at the dollar signs. And I think they really, you know, I'm a compliance guy, so my answer is going to be pretty straightforward. They need to have the regulatory framework in place because it's a huge investment, and people who are investing need to know that they're going to get a return on that investment. So I think they should be actively and aggressively working on the regulatory framework for when the 5G deployment comes out to do things. For example, in the United States, we actually had the FCC, and actually we got it passed in Congress. We call it co-location by right, where some carriers were having trouble co-locating on existing tower structures. So the Congress passed, and the president signed into law that requires jurisdictions to, by right, approve co-locations on existing towers. Those are the kinds of things that expedite deployment, speed to market, cuts cost. The faster they're operating, the faster they're generating revenue. The faster people are getting the service. These are the things that, you know, it economizes the whole process. So that's where my focus would be. As exciting as the money is, you got to have the rules in place to deploy it.
I agree with everybody here, but I'm bullish on Brazil. Okay, I'm very bullish. So our companies have been in there since 2012. First of all, the internet market in Brazil, you got 6,000 small ISPs going up against 4 big carriers, 3 of them that are your incumbents, and 1 that's just grown to be a big company. Okay, I think 5G should be opened up to the small guys. Okay, I don't know how they're going to financially afford it. Okay, but to proliferate that market, and you have a huge country. Not only do you have, but unfortunately, you're sort of like a country where Sao Paulo, the state, is one country the size of 50% of your population, and then you got some other social issues. Okay, in Sao Paulo, you got traffic problems. Okay, you're going to need technology to be able to help with the traffic problems. You leave Sao Paulo, go to places like Brasilia. Okay, you got water problems. And to me, that's astonishing for a country like Brazil, right? You got the wildfires that are going on in the Amazon, okay? Technology will help, okay? Because that's where the value of 5G and smart city technology converge, okay? That's where a lot of these governments need to understand that these investments, and I believe your country can invest in these things, okay? And they could be the model for the whole region, for Latin America. So I'm very bullish on your country. Thank you.
Hello. Hey, thanks so much for the panel. I'm enjoying learning about all this. So my question is, yes, my name is Moyambi and I'm with the IFC. So let's jump into 2020 because the predictions show that Latin America will have about 1.2% 5G penetration, and the US will be about 19%. So if we are talking about digital divide, it's already there, right, in addition to what's existing now. And I guess my question to you is, how do we start these economies or the technologies in El Salvador to be able to catch up? Because, the growing markets are already gone before, even the smaller markets have a chance to begin. And so there is in my view, there is no option for them to wait. And the question is, how do they get up to speed and how do they jump the gun?
Start. Well, I think, again, I want to go back to my original point, right? That there's a difference between what we're talking about, closing the gap, and 5G, and the usage of 5G, and the value of 5G. So some of the statistics I was mentioning earlier with the digital gap that we have, if you're looking at 4G, that will be closed, and that will hopefully happen over the next years when we're looking at the differences that I talked about between North America and Latin America. Of course, there are certain requirements for us getting to that point, which is allow us to buy the spectrum. Like I said, Latin America has been behind in allocating the spectrum according to ITU recommendations. Allow us to buy it at affordable cost. I will guarantee you that in a country like El Salvador, all the operators are dying to buy spectrum and to roll out more network. There is absolutely no question around that. So again, it comes back to the same debate. The governments need to also take a holistic approach, not just think about this year's budget, but indeed think about closing the gap. And in the meantime, what will hopefully happen, which actually is going to help Latin America, is that we'll have these use cases being run out elsewhere, and we'll probably also be able to learn from them and say, well, which ones are valuable and which ones are not. And you can not necessarily leapfrog, but you'll be able to benefit from that, right? And here we're not talking decades, we're talking years. So I am optimistic that there will be a gap closure, and I think, again, that the not just the intention, but also the belief is for many that 5G is not something that is for certain countries. I mean, 5G is for everyone. It's just a question of that no one really knows exactly how and yet and who will be able to best achieve it, right? But in the meantime, there's so much work to be done in Latin America to indeed close the gap, and that's what we need to focus on first.
Yeah, Moyambe, I'll tell you a few things we're doing at IFC to address this. I think that the shared digital infrastructure models, towers is a perfect example of this, data centers, but also fiber, are the kinds of things that we've been promoting, as you know, not, all within the LATAM region. So, for example, the city of Bucharest is looking at opening up duct systems so fiber can be laid in them. They're owned by the municipality, and so the condition is the provider would be a wholesale provider. But it's the kind of way a city can leverage its asset and nevertheless introduce a shareable model that allows for competition, which is critical. So I would say two big themes in terms of making all of this happen is shared infrastructure models, but also ensuring competition. If those principles can be embodied in the approach of municipalities and the national governments, that'll go a long way into bringing the private capital in. These are the kind of models we've been financing, as you know, with the tower firms and with the fiber firms. A project that another colleague is working on in Africa is a shared metro network. We're partnered with Google, and the metro networks are being rolled out within Central and West Africa in the major cities. So it's a wholesale model. These are the kinds of investable models that private capital will be drawn to, in addition to the mobile operators, who will maintain at the top of the ecosystem on connectivity a leading role, and then set the stage for all of these supporting kinds of structures underneath them. And my view is the minute you choke off competition, you invite corruption, and consumers are poorly served. Even if that body's meant to be regulated by governments, I think you have to have a bit of turbulence in the mix in terms of competition and push for shareable assets. Make available municipal assets that are shareable. These are the kinds of things that, for example, in Ghana some years back, what the environmental ministry said, we got too many telecom towers here. They were littering the landscape. So the environment minister said, well, you know what, if you put up a tower, you're going to have it co-located. And that meant there was a birth of tower companies in Ghana, just by decree out of the environment ministry. And it meant for a much more efficient infrastructure for Ghana, energy and otherwise. So there are big levers of policy, but it comes down to ensuring shareable models, I would say, and ensuring, nevertheless, competition.
I just want to add one thing about that. I think a country like Mexico is an interesting country. I don't think they started off thinking that what they're doing is they're actually in the process. I think they've made a lot of progress. Actually, I think you guys were involved in funding a national backbone wireless network. Okay, why? Well, first of all, in their country, they have one big player who controls most of the country's communications. They want to enable new companies coming in. Okay, I think taking what you just said on a shareable model, and all of a sudden the government is actually investing in this backbone. It is a PPP structure, and that will help create, give new entrants ability to get into this market. And if, I don't think they thought about it necessarily for 5G, but I think it will benefit projects like 5G. Just to put it in perspective, when I told you that we're building our 5G network in China, okay, half of that 5G towers is in collaboration with one of our competitors, China Unicom. Okay, so we're not doing this. It requires a lot of capital, even for companies, that come, well funded, right? It requires a lot of capital. So we're going to have to think as a necessity as to how to do some of these things. And the government's definitely going to have to think also how to encourage it or how to enable it.
And I would just, our mantra is co-location and neutral host. That's what we talk about. And that's the model that works for us. I'd also, I can send the link to Eric, but for those who haven't seen it, there was a Wall Street Journal reporter who recently did a test of 5G in the United States where she traveled across the United States, and she's got this little video on there. It's pretty entertaining because at some point she has a cooler with her because the phone overheats so much from the 5G that she has to keep putting it in the cooler. It demonstrated no in-building penetration. I mean, I found it interesting, and I think it shows that it's, it's an evolutionary process, and we're going to take those steps one step at a time. There's no instant way up the ladder.
Hello, thank you. Thank you so much for this conversation. I'm Karolina Kočková. I'm from Georgetown University, and I have a question to Eric, but to all of you about some of the advantages and disadvantages you see in the regulation between the city government and the national government, how private sector can take advantage of that, or on the other hand, help the governments to regulate, to incentivize investments in 5G or smart cities overall. Thank you.
That's a big topic. The biggest national level issue that we're talking about is really spectrum policy, the award of spectrum and in what bands. In terms of 5G, that's one of the big policies, and whether also the existing spectrum that it is now being used by the carriers can be refarmed for 5G. Is it technology neutral, the spectrum stack that they do have? So those are amongst the biggest issues that regulators face. And I would argue for technology neutrality. Spectrum's scarce. So governments tend to try to maximize revenue by saying, well, this should only be for 4G or this should be 5G. So what I would argue, technology neutral is important. And how a country divides up a spectrum is quite tricky because, the military has bands, there's all kinds of legacy. So that, has got to be worked out in some fashion. In terms of, how the national policy interacts with municipalities, well, you don't have to go very far to think about that. Here in Washington, they are contemplating sort of how the 5G topography will look for the city. Well, AT&T and Verizon each want to launch their own. They have their own fiber. Crown has fiber, and they'll host, was to be Sprint and T-Mobile. Of course, they're now unifying. So if you look at it visually from a municipal perspective, first things your citizens are going to ask, is there going to be a wire in front of me, you know, a transmitter every 50 feet, and what's it going to look like on my street? So the FCC has said, okay, you can't be in our way. Recently that was challenged in court, and there was a victory on the part of a tribe in Oklahoma saying, you know what, we can actually stop this rollout if we want to. To me, that's the core of where the tension will exist between the municipalities and the national plans. And that is evident in the case brought by San Francisco and Seattle and Marin County. A lot of that's being driven by health concerns, which I think, from what I read, are uninformed because the studies are really thin, patchy, and maybe not that well done. But part of it is also historic integrity and visual integrity of a built environment. So those, in fact, may end up being bigger issues than security in some American cities. Also, but I was listening to the mayor of San Salvador. I thought, well, gosh, I wish we had that kind of system here in the district, because it's, we have our own violence here, and there's some guns in this country. And so when I look at the trade-off between privacy and security, I was like, well, I'd probably vote for security, right? But anyway, the big tension between municipalities and the national level is really on those rollouts and what they look like. So I think the only way this really works is exactly what my colleagues are talking about. There has to be dialogue. The industry needs neutral representation, usually in the form of a good trade association, so they're not just advocating for themselves. And that the federal government is actually kind of receptive to what industry is saying, and the municipalities are somehow have a voice in this. But that in this country is going to turn into a much larger issue than it is today as 5G rolls out.
If I can just add maybe something that we didn't touch on, the health point, which I do think we'll probably see more about, or there will be more discussion, and it will probably be used as I think it's something that's, of course, important to look into, and I think there will be more studies needed. But just to make one point, and the teams helping me with some of my notes, we're having a lot of fun with this, that, the World Health Organization has actually done a report on this, and they concluded that they classified the threat posed by radio frequency radiation as being equivalent to the risks posed by eating pickled vegetables and using talcum powder. Now, I'm not sure exactly what those risks are, but just to sort of put it into perspective, that's apparently from the WHO at this point.
Hi, Jessica Soto from Alliance Science and Technology. So we talked about shared infrastructure, but I was wondering a little bit about shared spectrum. Are the auctions in Latin America generally requiring incumbent users to transition out of the bands, or any looking at kind of spectrum coordination or sharing through either new technologies or technologies that already exist?
The things that you're asking, which is a big question, has to do with whether these networks spectrum can be actively shared. You're kind of hinting that in your question. That's actually not that common globally. We have it in the UK. The US is kind of launching it with the refarming of the Citizens Band radio spectrum. And there are a few other places working on this. But when you think about it, given the cost of 5G, it does beg the question. So, if you put up a little small cell outside the door here, right now that just serves either Verizon or T-Mobile or somebody, right? And with active sharing, well, the neutral host could be owned by somebody else, gives them each a piece of capacity. So you don't need 15 small cells surrounding the building. You only need a handful, right? So I think that 5G forces this debate on active sharing to come to the front, simply because of what I was talking about in terms of rollout. I think it is going to be quite disruptive as it is implemented in this way. And there are enough examples of active sharing come up. You see this come up also in rural models where governments are trying to figure out how to get rural coverage. Well, you have to figure out how to make it as cheap as possible. The cheapest way you can do it is sharing everything. Local switching, local caching of data, everything that you could possibly do to reduce the costs of backhaul transmission, a single piece of active equipment shared by everything. So I think these two forces are in some ways starting to push the debate on active sharing. And I think that's one of the legacies of 5G is going to be exactly that.
We actually have a question from the webcast, if you wouldn't mind me asking it. Okay. So I believe this is in context of U.S. policy limiting countries in the region with their interactions with China. But the question is, if a country accepts Huawei or China's offer to implement smart cities for security, how difficult or expensive would it be to scale them up later for education or B2B purposes?
You're asking about Huawei being able to be the equipment deployed in Latin America?
Yes.
Huawei is in Latin America. Let me give you a little quick story about Huawei. All right, their international expansion started in a small little country called Ecuador. Okay, from there they proliferated the whole region. Okay, the reality of the matter is that Huawei is a technology company. All right, that has built some technology that started 7 years ago and plus planning on this called 5G. Okay. And I think the governments in Latin America do welcome them. Okay. I do believe that those governments in Latin America will continue to welcome them. I'm hopeful that other things get resolved over time. The reality is that we need technology. And their technology is good. All right, I was just in Canada, and I was talking to the CEO of a very large telecom operator. Canada is adopting 5G technology from Huawei. Okay, I don't think it's going to stop Canada and the U.S. from working together. I think those type of things will continue to sort of work through dialogue and communication. But I think 5G and Huawei in Latin America will continue.
Maybe to add to that, I think one thing that we forget about when we were talking the U.S. and China is it's borderless when it comes to the rest of us. It's not only about China and the U.S. And yes, absolutely, the Latin American governments will continue to have Huawei in the country. Some will be welcoming them. But we also have to remember that U.S. legislation can have very far reach, and many of the operators in the region, although they're not American, may still fall under U.S. jurisdiction, right? And so it's a lot more complicated than perhaps a question of U.S. and China, and then what do the Latin American governments want, you know, where you also have to consider what will be legally possible for the companies who might have a touch point with either U.S. or Chinese legislation. That said, Chinese technology providers are not the only ones in the world, and I think certainly most operators have a multi-vendor strategy. But again, of course, this is something that, you know, looking towards Eric's part of the world, it will be more costly perhaps, right? And not everyone is as ready, and not everyone has as developed technology to provide at certain price points. So it's a very, very complex situation where it goes far beyond just you know, a sort of debate between two countries and or views of governments.
Thank you. We have time for one more question, which is right here.
Rachel, my question is to you. I agree on several things that you've said. And as you rightly pointed out, many operators in Latin America rolled out 3G, 4G. Adoption is still relatively low. And there was research that was done that the reasons for the low uptake is because basically that usage gap. So they have coverage, but they're not using the service, despite mobile operators having laid out a lot of capital to expand the network to meet regulatory requirements or just to meet their own internal targets. Now, government, in addition to selling spectrum and permitting and regulation, also have a key role to encourage adoption, whether it's driving literacy skills and also reducing taxation. Because these mobile operators are seen as cash cows. The taxes on handsets are always very high, as Eric mentioned, that handset prices might go down to 300, but if you have high taxes on top of that, then it means the number of people who can reach it is very few. So you mentioned that the governments are keen on actually making it work. How keen are they really? I mean, are they willing to make some of these cuts, on tax and all?
From the IFC as well, because it's like music to my ears.
Sorry,
yes.
I'm Charlotte from IFC.
Couldn't agree more. No. Everything you said is absolutely how certainly we see the world and would like to think is probably our reality. I would say, I don't want to rank the countries that we're in specifically, and we are mainly in Central America and then a number of large countries in South America, but we're not in Brazil, we're not in Argentina or Mexico, so I'll let others speak for that. But I do think that certainly most governments, they are genuinely keen. But I think that we also have to think about a capacity and a capability issue. This is all developed so fast, not just in Latin America, but across the world. We have telecom legislation that in countries like, I think it's Paraguay and Panama, dates back to the mid-90s. We have regulators that are trying to catch up as fast as they can, but, they need resources to do so. So I think the genuine intent is there, but there's also an education to be had of all of us, right? Of how do we best structure this? What resources do we need? And that takes time. If you look at the markets that we're talking about, there's still also development to be had on many other fronts, education, labor. And I think that you're absolutely right to say the coverage is there, not necessarily 4G coverage, but some coverage is there. And for example, we as an operator spend tremendous amount of time on education. What does it mean? What can the internet do for you? It's not all about Facebook and YouTube. How can we make sure that people understand the usage? Looking at children, for example, which is one of our big areas, the parents and the teachers that we would rely on here to bring children online and bring them online safely, they might not even themselves know how to use it and what the benefits are. So this is, again, a very multifaceted issue where it requires a lot more than just a regulator and the telecoms focused part of government. It requires cross-functional efforts on behalf of ministries of education, family, security, as I said, labor. But I do genuinely believe that when they see the benefits of it, and in particular those countries with the security issues where 5G probably can make a huge difference, yes, they do genuinely want it, but there is an educated process for all of us in terms of how do we get to what we think it can do for us.
Terrific. Thank you so much, and thank you for the excellent comments and questions. Please join me in thanking our panelists. Thank you. And we'll have you back in a year to talk about 6G, right? Is that, yeah. Okay, great.